Welcome, Herb. It's
Thank
great
you.
having you here with us.
It's great being here. Thank you so much.
And so we're just going to turn on our live stream right now. Is that coming together, Alan? All right. Well, special welcome to everybody watching us over at Hornby. Thanks for being a part with us today. And a special welcome to those watching at home online, whether you're in New Zealand, Australia, or somewhere else around the world. It's great to see one of our friends watching us in Germany. And a special welcome to you too. So wherever you're watching, whether you're listening on DVD or watching live, thanks for being here today. To start off with, Herb, we just wanted to get to know you a little bit. So Herb, tell us about yourself. Tell us where you're from. Tell us a little bit about your family. Tell us how you find yourself doing this, living this life where you go around the world talking to people.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. We'll start with the simple ones first. My name's Herb. I am director of Renewed Heart Ministries. I have 3 children. I have 1 wife. My children's names are Alexis, Emeria, and Christian. Alexis is our 17-year-old daughter. Emeria is our 11-year-old daughter. And Christian is our 6-year-old son. We named him that to make sure that there would be at least one of them in the family. But to explain how I got into doing this, I don't know. One day back in 1998, that's how long it's been, I picked up the phone. I was teaching school, and someone said, "Would you come to our church and share with our church what you've been teaching our son in the classroom?" And I said, "Sure." And the phone has just been ringing ever since.
Wow.
And so that's all we've ever done is pick up the phone when it rings. I never envisioned myself doing this. It's just where the Lord has led.
So basically through word of mouth.
That's it.
It all began with you teaching students about God and answering some of the confusing and big questions of life. And
attempting to.
Good on you. And just through word of mouth, one thing's led to another, and
here we are in New Zealand today.
Here on the other side of the globe.
That's right.
Many of us here have been blessed by listening and tuning into some of your messages on the internet and online, and it's a real privilege to have you here with us today.
I'm actually amazed by that. I'm shocked that there are people in New Zealand listening all the way over here to some guy over in West Virginia. That's just crazy to me.
Yeah.
But I'm so humbled and thankful for that. Thank you for inviting me here.
Awesome. Good on you. I think we, as Kiwis, we're kind of shocked that we'd be tuning into American as well. No, we can.
I love it.
It is great having you here. And we're really looking forward to the topics that you've got lined up for us today. Can you give us a little bit of a heads up about what we've got coming up today, and then also Monday to Friday, and then next Saturday?
Yes. This morning's topics, this morning I'm going to share with you my story. And as we get into that, it'll make more sense why. It's going to lay the foundation, it's going to be our springboard that we leap off of through the rest of the week. And then the second presentation this morning, we're going to be looking at what I consider to be the most relevant question that people are really asking. And that is, if God really loves us, then why does life look like such a train wreck here on this planet? And why am I going through what most people call a living hell if God is so good? This week, we'll be covering topics that I summarize as Jesus for skeptics. We're not looking at the Jesus story to prove the Jesus story historically. We're looking at the ethical teachings of Jesus that are embedded in that story and asking if there's any relevance for what Jesus taught to our lives today in the 21st century, religious or secular. And so that will be basically to look at Jesus and his ethical teachings in our life today. And then next weekend, we'll end with the awakening, which is if we do see something relevant in what Jesus taught, his picture of God, his way of looking at ourselves, his way of looking at everyone else, what does that lead us to? What's next? Where do we go from here? And so that's next weekend.
Wow, thanks for giving us that overview. You know, I think that today's topic, I think we've called today's 2-part series, Why God, Why? Thinking about God and pain and suffering. I think it's a question that every thinking person grapples with. And it's a great privilege to have you here to start off the series with this talk. Monday to Friday is going to be at Addington, Samoan. And so that's on Brougham Street. We'll tell you a bit more about how to find that. Then next weekend, we will be running Herb's program here. He's going to be in Hornby, and through the cameras, we're going to watch Herb live right here as well. So whether you want to drive over to Hornby or come here again, same time next week for the final part of the program, that'll be great. Herb, I'd love to pray to start off
Absolutely.
today. And let's bow our heads and ask for God's blessing. Father in heaven, thank you that we can pray to you and talk to you at any time. Today we're looking at some of the most confusing and challenging topics about life and pain itself. And so, God, we want to ask that you would bless everybody here, everyone who can see these presentations, whether they're here with us or somewhere else. And we're asking that you would speak to us and encourage us, and that we'd find answers for what we're looking for. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Herb. Over
Thank
to
you,
you.
Ben. Well, good morning to you once again. I'm going to share with you a little bit of my own story, and in order to do that, before we get into the hard topics of why God, why, we need to lay a foundation. How many of you have a memory from when you were 4 years of age? You can go back as far as 4, all right? How about 3? How many can go back as far as 3? That's usually, okay, a couple of you. The hands begin to dwindle. How about 2? Can any go back as far as 2? Like 1, okay, all right, well, okay. Yeah, but it's easier for you than some of the others in the room. But yes, absolutely. Any others? Can any go back as far as 1? Anybody have? All right, man, good on you. There's usually only one person in the room that can do that. My earliest memory in life was when I was 4 years old. I don't know if they had these things over in New Zealand, but in the States, in the 70s, they had these metal high chairs. They weren't the nice, safe plastic ones like we have today. They had the 2 metal rods that protruded off of either side. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Had the stainless steel tray that clamped down on the top. And you could have been raised in an atheist home. It didn't matter. You still prayed to whatever was out there that there were no body parts near that sucker when it went off. I mean, it made the worst sound. But I was seated there, stainless steel tray, and I don't know if you had these over here, but in the States in the 70s, we had these Tupperware bowls. Some of them were yellow, some of them were orange, some of them, well, the one that was, did you guys have those over here too? Oh, still do? Oh, good, okay. Well, I had a stainless steel tray, puke green Tupperware bowl on this stainless steel tray, and in this stainless steel tray was my favorite breakfast cereal of all time. Anyone want to guess what that was? Wheat Bix. I wish it was. I regrettably have to say, close. It was Fruit Loops. Do you guys have Fruit Loops over here? Yeah, Fruit Loops. Still my favorite breakfast cereal of all time. I was sitting there, stainless steel tray, puke in Tupperware bowl, filled with Fruit Loops, 4 years of age, eating my breakfast. My mother was standing to my right. My father was standing to my left. And does anyone want to guess what was transpiring between them? Yeah, communication. You've got parents too. Yeah, someone said fight. It was a discussion. But it was a discussion of such intensity that it lodged itself in my 4-year-old heart and my 4-year-old mind as my first memory in life. It was so intense, it wiped out everything up until that point. And there I was, my mother and my father, in an argument. That's ironically the only memory I have while my parents were still married. Does anyone here come from a split home? You know something of what it means to grow up with parents that are no longer together. My folks, before I could turn 5, went through what many couples do today. They became separated and then divorced, and I found myself being raised by a single mom in West Virginia in the late 70s. Now, if you know anything about West Virginia, out of all the states, West Virginia is one of the most economically challenged in the United States. We were dirt poor in the 70s. Many times what we ate for dinner at night depended upon how much my mother made in tips during the day. Now, I gave you a hint. Does anyone want to guess what she did for work? Someone always says waitress because I said tips. And yes, that's a good guess, but she wasn't a waitress. And I said during the day, so it wasn't that either. Any other guesses? She cut hair for a living. She was a hairdresser, and she would cut hair all day long and then making... All right. And then make tips. She would drop me off early in the morning at my aunt's house. I'd be in my blue Superman pajamas with the feet sewn into them. Anybody remember those? You could slide across the hardwood floors. And then by the time she picked me up in the evening, she had worked so long that day that I was back in my pajamas once again. I don't think my mother ever saw me in normal clothes during those years. The only time my mother and I really ever got was on the weekends. And although the time we had together was very limited, that time was very special, and we began to become close friends. It was just my mom and I. And as I was getting closer and closer to my mother, there was something else being shaped for me back then that I wouldn't have known how to put into words. I remember overhearing about this man that everyone referred to as my father. Now, I had overheard how he refused to pay child support. Do you guys call it that over here? Okay. He refused to pay child support. He had run off with another woman, is what I had heard. He had abandoned us. And this is no exaggeration. I grew up in a very small town of about 2,500 people. The streets in that town are not very large. And I grew up on the same street, actually, that my own father also lived on. 20 houses away from him, same side of the street. I passed his house every day on the way to school, and I passed his house every day on the way home from school, and birthdays would come and go. He is 20 houses away, and birthdays would come and go, and not so much as even a birthday card to say, "Happy birthday, son. Hope you're doing well." When I turned 14, I decided I was going to go meet my father for the very first time. Is there anyone here that you've had, it's kind of a compulsory nature, you've had something in your life you didn't want to do, but you felt like you should do it, so you did it anyway, even though your heart, anybody ever experienced something like that? Hopefully this morning is not one of those events for any of you. But I can remember going to visit my dad for the very first time, and his wife looks at me, and she says, "You know, Herb, your father really loves you and wishes you would visit more often." Now, I was raised by a single mom who had taught me at a very young age when to open my mouth in response to an adult and when to keep it shut. And I remember thinking, I didn't say this, but I remember thinking to my stepmother, my father's wife, "Love? Dad loves me? Man, what Dad needs for his birthday is a Webster's Dictionary. I could define for him what love is, and this has not been it." But I continued to go back and visit nonetheless. I thought he's half the reason I'm on this crazy planet. I owe it to him to get to know him. Then I turned 16, and something happened that radically changed the rest of my days. Anyone want to guess what that was? Back in the States, there's only 3 things that can happen to an individual, to a male, when they're 16. Either you get a car, you meet Jesus, or you meet a girl. That's right. And I met the woman of my dreams. And I knew from the first moment I saw her, when she walked in the room, I said, "That is the woman that I'm going to spend the rest of my life with." And some of you are right now kind of cynical, and you're thinking, "Well, you're only 16, Herb. How did you know that?" Is there anybody here this morning that's ever been 16 before? Yeah. And what did you know when you were 16? Everything. That's right. That's right. And I knew I was going to spend the rest of my life with this woman. And what's ironic is she knew the exact same thing from the first time she saw me, that I wanted to marry her, that is. And so she kept me at arm's distance, ladies, until we were about 18. We began to be just friends. Do you know what that's like? People say, "What's going on with you and so-and-so?" And everyone else can see it, but you're still in denial. You say, "Oh, we're just friends." That's right. So we began to be just friends. And then at age 19, things began to get more serious. At that time, I had left the East Coast, and I was living on the West Coast in California. And my wife was successfully going to college in Southern California, and I was giving it my honest effort in Northern California. And at about halfway point of that year, I thought, I am wasting my life. I need to ask this woman to marry me. And so I met her in Central California, and we don't have time for all of the details this morning, but I met her in Central California, and I had all the arrangements made, all the gifts purchased. It was a Friday evening, the sun was setting, we were on the beach, the water was lapping against the shore, the waves, the rocks, you could hear the romantic music in the background. I took her hand. She had no clue what the weekend was about. This was total surprise to her. I took her hand in mine. I went down on one knee, looked her in the eye, and at that moment it dawned on her what was about to happen. True story. She took her hand out of mine. She stuck it straight out like this, and she looked me in the eye and she said, "Don't even think of asking me to marry you." Now, I'd been hanging out with this chick since I was 16. That's 3 years. The hope of 3 years in that one moment died. And then she said one word that I'll forever be thankful for. She said, "Until." Hope revived. Until when? What's the condition? She looked me in the eye one last time and she said, "Until you first have a relationship with your father, because I'm not going to marry anyone who has a dysfunctional relationship with either one of their parents. And I thought, whoa, not only is she drop dead gorgeous, she's actually kind of smart. And then I thought about it a little further. Talk about visits of a compulsory nature. Now I'm really going to visit Dad, not because I want to, but because I have to. So I moved back to West Virginia. I began to engage my father. Have you ever had something that the harder you tried, the harder it got? The more energy you put into it, the more frustration you get back. It's like that proverbial carrot right beyond your fingertips. You want it so bad, but you can't quite. That's what a relationship was like with my dad. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you this morning. The relationship between my father and I, it never did happen. Now, I did get it to the place where my wife was deceived enough to say I do, and we did get married. But it never really clicked until about 3 years into the marriage. We were seated in my father's living room. He was on one couch. My wife and I were on another couch. It was the beginning of our marriage. Our oldest child was about 2.5 at that time, and she was upstairs, I think, playing with Legos. Do you guys have Legos here in New Zealand? All right, it's not that different. I'm sure it's very different, but there's something similar. But she was upstairs playing, and my wife has this ability to make people feel loved, to make people feel safe, to make people feel comfortable. It's one thing to love other people. It's another thing to be especially gifted in the ability of communicating that love to other people. And my wife, if she were with me this trip, and I regret that she's not, and she sends you her greetings, but if she were with me on this trip, I would, right in front of her, warn all of you. Because if you were to spend too much time with her, she has a way of making you feel so comfortable that if she were to ask you questions about yourself, you would begin confessing things to her that you wouldn't even tell a Catholic priest. That's how my wife relates to people. Well, she starts doing this thing that evening in my father's living room with my dad. And my dad's one of those macho men. He's a tough guy. He never cries. If he's getting pink around the edges of his eyelids, his eyes are sweating. He's not crying. And so he's sitting there. You could tell by his body language, his arms uncrossed. He begins to relax. He begins to not laugh, but smile at my wife's jokes. And I'm noticing what's going on in the room, and the more relaxed he's becoming, the more anxious I'm becoming. Because I've seen her do this to too many other people. I know she's up to something. And this time, who's she doing it to? My dad, that's right. And so I give her that look. And I know some of you are here this morning with your spouses. I don't care how happily married you are to your spouse. At some point in the marriage, one of you is going to give the other one this look. It is the look with no words exchanged. It's just a look that says, what on earth are you doing right now? Anybody ever given or gotten that look before? Yeah, sometimes men get it more than women. I get that. And my wife gave me back a look, and this is a look that strikes fear into the heart of every man. Men can't give this look. If we try to give this look, we look guiltier than when we started. People ask me, they say, Herb, where did women learn how to give this look? I don't know. I have a 16-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old daughter, and both of them have been able to give me this look since they were in diapers. I have no clue. But she gave me back this look, no words exchanged. She just said it all right with her eyes. It's a look that said, when I questioned her, what on earth are you doing right now? She gave me back a look that said, oh, nothing. That's the look that strikes fear into the heart of every man. So I began to get even more nervous, and then I watched it. It was like in slow motion, and I could do nothing to stop it. My wife looks at my dad in his most vulnerable moment. And she says, Herb, now his name is Herb as well. I'm a second. That is the only way a 38-year-old male in the year 2014 can possess the name Herbert, is if they're a second, all right? His name is Herb as well. She said, Herb, she's talking to him. She says, I have a question, but I don't know how to ask it. We're from West Virginia. He looked at her and said, well, shoot, darling, just come right out and say it. So she said, all right. I'd like to know why you didn't visit your son more often when he was a little boy. Hello? I'm in the room. You got him all prepared to talk about this. What about me? I'm not ready to discuss this topic. Under the couch was looking awfully feasible at the moment. And you should have seen my dad. He sat back up on the couch. He crossed his arms. He uncrossed them. He crossed his arms. He uncrossed them. He looked at her, looked at me, looked at the floor. Looked back at me, looked back at her, looked at the floor. After what seemed like an indefinite period of silence, he looks back up at me. And I will not tell you he was crying. But his eyelids were beginning to become pink. And he said these words. He said, when I left your mother. And that first phrase stuck with me because I had been raised always being told he had abandoned who? It was us. But when I heard us, I didn't hear plural. I heard me. He said, when I left your mother, he said, I never in my wildest imagination even conceived of the thought that I would be losing you. He taught me of a very lengthy and heated custody battle. And at that stage, I'm thinking, yeah, right, there's two sides to every story. I grew up on that side. I get it. He looks at me, perceiving my skepticism. He says, there's something you guys need to see. He says, I know you love your mother very much, and I would hate to do anything to disturb that. He said, but I think you're old enough to know something. He stood up, he walked into his dining room. My wife and I followed him. He has this huge antique buffet, and as he opens up one of the drawers, he pulls out something like a shoebox. And as he lifts the lid off of that shoebox, those of you who have not read my book, does anyone want to guess what was in that shoebox? Letters. Someone always said, that's a good guess. Good guess. Not letters. Not good guess. Good guess. Not birthday cards. Photos, that's a good guess as well. Back in the States in the 70s and 80s, before the digital age, when you would get your monthly statement from your bank, your financial institution, you would not only get your statement, you would get a stack of something. Did it work that way over here as well? You would get a stack of all of the canceled checks that you had written back to you in the mail. They had been processed in someone else's bank account and returned with your monthly statement. In this shoebox, anyone want to guess what was there now? Was every child support check my father had ever written. I looked at the dates in which they had been processed. Never was one late. Never was one missing. And when you looked at the amounts, many times they were written for significantly more than what the state required of him. I looked there at these checks, and it begins to dawn on me what has happened. I look up into the eyes of my father, and I see something there that I had never seen. I had never seen it up to this point, and I have not seen it since. I looked into the eyes of my father, and there were tears streaming down this man's face who never cries. He had waited 23 years to tell me this story. Tears streaming down his cheeks as he choked out for me the story of birthday presents that were thrown away by my mom, or pictures that had come back to him with nothing on them but return to sender. And in that moment, something inside of me changed forever. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt something in that moment that I had, 23 years of age, that 4-year-old heart was feeling something in that moment that I had never felt before. Anyone want to guess what that was? For the first time in my life, I loved my dad, because for the first time, I genuinely felt as if I was loved by my dad. Now, why am I sharing this story with you this morning? Why do we begin this whole week with this story? Because I am convinced this is the story of every single one of us here in this room. You say, well, my parents are still together. That's not what I'm talking about. You see, I believe each one of us has been raised in homes, in social environments, secular environments, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but I have to say this as well, even church environments, where intentionally or unintentionally we have been being told lies about our Heavenly Father. How do I know this? Have you ever had, and I'm going to ask for a level of honesty this morning, it might be a little uncomfortable, but has anyone here ever had the whole God thing, trying to have a relationship with God, be where the harder you tried, the harder it got? Anyone ever experienced that before with Him? Where you feel like your prayers aren't going above the ceiling? Anyone ever been there before? Where you feel like the more energy you put into the God stuff, the more difficult it becomes? Can you go to your people that you respect and you say, well, how do I have this relationship with God? And you're usually told one of three things. You just need to pray more. How many have ever heard that answer before? And don't misunderstand me. I think prayer is vital. Or you'll hear answer number 2. You just need to study your Bible more. How many have ever heard that answer before? And don't get me wrong, is Bible study important? Yes. Or you need to go to church or worship or share your faith. That third question can be a myriad of different things to do that people give you in order to manufacture a relationship with God. Here's my problem with all of those answers. Think of the story between my father and I. Was the problem between my dad a lack of effort on my part? Marriage to the most beautiful, gorgeous, intelligent, exceptional woman on the planet was hanging in the balance, dependent upon me having a relationship with this man. Do you think I wasn't trying hard enough? So it wasn't a lack of effort. If the problem wasn't a lack of effort, stay with me. If the problem wasn't a lack of effort, then being told what to do would not be the solution. See if you agree. The problem was not that I wasn't trying hard enough. It was that I had the wrong picture of the person I was trying to have a relationship with. And when that picture became corrected, the relationship just fell into place. How many would love to experience something of that nature with God this week? You see, many of us have tried for years, and I don't want to discount that. But there's some of us in this room that have tried so hard, we honestly don't feel like we have much left to try with. There is hope for you. The problem is not a lack of effort. I'm convinced the challenge that lies before us is not going to be solved by just trying harder. The challenge that lies before us is to allow God to bring us to a place where we can allow Him to change even some of our most cherished pictures of what He's like. Let me explain it this way. Is there a possibility that there's someone in this room that may have a lot of religious topics figured out, and yet they have a very ugly picture of God? Is that possible? How many would think that's possible? Is it possible that that person could be very religious, have an ugly picture of God, and not even know their picture of God is that ugly? How many would agree that's a possibility? So it's possible that someone in this room could be very religious, have an ugly picture of God. It's possible that they could be very religious, have an ugly picture of God, and not know they have an ugly picture of God. Is it possible, here's my third question I'll ask you this morning, is it possible that that person in this room that we're referring to could be you, who may be very religious, have a very ugly picture of God, and not even know it? Could that be you? Take your handouts with me this morning. Ben, if you could or have someone pass those, either way, pass those out. There's a few passages here I want us to look at before we end. We have about 18 minutes left, and in the time that we have remaining, I want to read for you a statement from William Temple. William Temple, who was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote these words: if our concept of God is wrong, the more religious we get, the more dangerous we are to ourselves and others. What is Temple saying here? If your concept of God is wrong, if your picture of God is wrong, the more religious you become, the more ardent you become in your following of that God, the more dangerous you become to yourself and everyone else around you. I don't know what it's like here in New Zealand, but I know back in the States, religion has become very harmful to certain people in the United States. How many have noticed that? It's become very dangerous. So much so that there is a movement in the States that has been labeled neo-atheism. It was spearheaded, it's championed by those like Daniel Dennett, by the late Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. Anyone here this morning know those names? All right. Neo-atheism's solution to the danger of religion is to say that God is not good and the idea of an existence of a God out there should be abandoned. Now, here's where I'm at. I agree with the assessment that religion as it is presently has done untold damage. How many would agree with that? People have been hurt by religion. But here's my challenge. Is the solution to throw out the idea of God at all? Or is the solution to rediscover a God that looks like that Jewish carpenter 2,000 years ago? What does it mean to embrace that the God of this universe actually looks like Jesus? It's not a platitude. It's not a cliche. To believe that God looks like Jesus will challenge your most fundamental and precious assumptions within whatever religious environment you subscribe to. What does it mean to embrace that God looks like Jesus? Let's look at this passage, John 14, 6 through 10. Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And I would just simply add, that may be conscious or unconscious. I believe there are many today being drawn to God through Jesus, and many of them don't even realize it yet. Would you agree with that? If you really know me, he says, you will know my what? So how do we know the Father? How do we get a correct picture of God? It's through coming to know who? Jesus. He says, if you really know me, you will know my Father as well. And watch this next statement. He says, from now on, you do know him and have seen him. Bizarre. Philip says to him, Lord, show us the Father and it'll be enough for us. You're talking about this. Show us the Father. And Jesus answers, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the what? And then he explains what he means by this. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe? This is the game changer. Don't you believe that I am where? In the Father, and that the Father is where? What does that mean? He says, the words that I say to you, I don't even speak on my own authority. Rather, it is who? The Father, stay with me, living where? In me, doing whose work? This is key. Where was the Father according to Jesus? Not somewhere out there. Are you with me? Where was the Father according to Jesus? It was the Father was in Jesus, so much so that Jesus is saying, I'm not just telling you what God is like. I'm not some third party over here telling you what he's like. When you look at me, the Father is living where? And the words that I'm saying to you, they're not just my words. It is actually the Father living in me, doing his work. I am just the translucent conduit. In other words, Jesus and the Father are not two different types of people. Are you with me? Every time you see Jesus, some people, Jared McKenna of Perth, Australia, says it this way. Some people's picture of God is a God that needs to ask Jesus into their heart. Think about that for a moment. Needs to become more Christ. No, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Whenever we see Jesus, we are to see who in that moment? This is where the challenge is. Moses says that a woman caught in the midst of adultery should be stoned. And yet we see not Jesus, but God finding a way to not stone her, even though the law requires it. Do you get that? A woman with an issue of blood, what does the law state? Don't touch anyone. You are unclean, and if you touch someone else, they will become unclean too. And so this woman with the issue of blood, what does she decide to do? Well, I'll just touch what do you remember? Talk to me this morning. The hem of his garment. This was not an act of faith on this woman in the sense that I don't need to really touch him. All I can do is graze his clothing and I will be healed. No, this was a woman who knows that in order to be healed, she has to touch Jesus. But the law forbids her to touch anyone. So what is she trying to do in just touching the hem of his garment? What is she trying to do? She's trying to find a legal loophole through which to still get to Jesus. And this is why when Jesus turns around in that crowd, he actually quotes Leviticus and says, what question? He asks which question? Who touched me? And bless his heart, Peter. Peter gives me hope. Peter says, well, what do you mean who touched you? We're in a crowd. Everybody's touching you. Jesus shakes his head. Deal with you later. Jesus goes back to Leviticus. No, who touched me? And the woman steps out of the crowd. And what emotion is she feeling? Do you remember? What emotion? Fear. Why is she afraid? Because what has she done? She thought she was finding a legal loophole, but Jesus is quoting Leviticus and asking, who broke the law? That's challenging. Because she comes forward and she confesses, and Jesus says, he doesn't call her activity breaking the law. He calls it an act of faith. How is that? Had she broken what Leviticus commanded? Yes. No way around it. We find another story of a leper, 10 of them actually, who become cleansed. 9 of them want to get back into their religious community. They're focused on belonging once again. They're going back to the priest. One of them's a Samaritan. He knows there is no religious community for him to go to. He wasn't shut out for being a leper only. He was also shut out for being a Samaritan. He goes back to Jesus, thanks him for the healing, and Jesus pronounces him clean, right? What does that mean? You no longer need priest. You no longer need temple. You no longer need sacrifice. Your identity is based now on your relation to me, not that religious community. And Jesus says every time we see him, we're to see who? This is God. How many realize that to envision a deity like that challenges every religion on this planet, regardless of what it is? How many can begin to see that just in those 3 stories? Jesus challenges taboos. Jesus challenges requisites. Jesus challenges fundamental prohibitions. And he reaches out and says, if you've seen me, you've seen who? You've seen God. Now, we're going to be looking at it this morning in the context of human suffering. I am convinced that Christianity today is very confused on the subject of human suffering. If you were to go to our good Buddhist brothers and sisters and ask them, why is there human suffering? The answer they would give us is it's just a matter of perception. There's no such thing as human suffering. You just need to see it differently. If you were to ask our good Hindu brothers and sisters why there is human suffering, they would give you the answer: somebody somewhere must have done something wrong. It's their fault if they're suffering. We believe in karma. You must have done something in a previous life to get what you're experiencing in this life. So if we were to ask our good Muslim brothers and sisters, why is there human suffering? Why does Allah allow suffering? They would say it's blasphemous to even ask why. You don't question God. And I don't know what it's like here, but back in the States, if you ask a Christian why there's human suffering, do you know what answer you'll get back? One of those three. You'll get the Buddhist answer, the Hindu answer, or the Muslim answer. You'll hear, oh, one day you'll see it from his perspective and know this is a blessing, not a curse. How many have heard that before? Providence writes straight with crooked lines. That, by the way, that's the Buddhist answer. You will hear the Hindu answer. Well, somebody somewhere must have sinned. How many have heard that before? The flooding of New Orleans. How much time do I have? How many remember the flooding of New Orleans over here, there in the States? I watched the news every night. Good, well-meaning, fundamental Christians saying that this was the judgment of God upon New Orleans for its gross immorality. Well, I had the opportunity a few years after the floodings to go to New Orleans and take some historic tours. And you can judge me later. I went during the day, but I even took some tours of the historic French Quarter. And what I noticed, out of all of the areas in New Orleans, do you know which section is built on the highest elevation? It's the French Quarter. Do you know which section of the French Quarter is built on the highest elevation of even that section? Bourbon Street. If you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, Google it. But be careful. Do you know which section of New Orleans is classified as possesses the most rampant immorality? The French Quarter. Do you know which section received zero flood damage? The French Quarter. I would submit to you that if the flooding of New Orleans was because of its gross immorality and the French Quarter received zero flood damage, God missed. It's not a judgment of God on their sin. If you were to ask good Christians also, well, why is there human? You will hear from some Christians, it is not appropriate to question God. It's not even okay to ask is it okay to ask God why? Does he have shoulders that are big enough for us to ask why? Does he have a chest that is big enough for us to beat on it when we don't understand? What I'm going to submit to you in our second presentation this morning is that although Christianity, I believe, is confused on this topic, the Jesus story that we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John gives us a very unique answer to the question of why there is suffering, to the problem of human suffering. The Jesus story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to believe that God looks like Jesus, it gives us a radically different picture of God and a radically different answer to this dilemma than not only what Buddhism gives, than not only what Hindus offer, not only what we find within the religion of Islam, but it's also a radically different answer than what we are hearing today from modern contemporary Christianity. How many would be interested to discover what the answer is in the Jesus story to human suffering? How many would be interested in that? It's not so much about your religious beliefs as it is a question of what is your picture of God. Jesus came here to give us a radically different way to see God, to see ourselves, and to see everyone else around us. And it's Jesus' invitation into this new way of seeing that he's inviting us this morning. Thank you so much for having me here in your church. God bless you.
Thank you, Herb. Everybody who's watching over at Hornby or elsewhere, thanks for joining us. Please do tune in again at around 11 o'clock when we're going to have Herb back for our second session. Thank you. And right now,